Hi everyone, we are on the home straight. For those of you who weren't here before, my name is Fiammetta Rocco. I'm the culture correspondent of The Economist, and we are going to talk about the canon, as Tim told you. Canon, the story of art history, and how it gets written. So, the canon was a Western canon, largely written by men in New York, in London, and in Paris, and this was deemed to be the canon of modern art. In reality, as we've learned more and more and more over the years, there were many modernisms, there were many modernist canons. There was magnificent modernism in Brazil. There was the Gutai movement in Japan. There was a fantastic school of Iranian pop in Tehran, which we will learn so much more about when we can get to go to the Guggenheim Abu Dhabi. So I can't wait for that to open. So what is the canon of art history that's being written and rewritten now? Who's writing this story? What new connections are being made, and where is it heading? My panelists today are Maya Allison, Executive Director and Chief Curator at the NYU Abu Dhabi Art Gallery. She's also the curator of the UAE Pavilion at this year's Venice Biennale, and if you haven't been there, there's still a month to go where you can catch it, and it's really worth going to. Manal Ataya, Director General of the Sharjah Museum Authority, a powerhouse in the region, which we'll hear more about in due course. Rafał Niemojewski, Executive Director of the Biennial Foundation and one of the world's foremost experts on the potency of exhibitions. And lastly, someone who needs no introduction here because you know him so well, collector, but also a scholar and a teacher. Sultan Saud Al-Qasimi, founder of the Barjeel Art Foundation. Rafał, let's start with you. I don't know where you've come from, but I know you go halfway around the world at least twice a week. One of the big developments of the last 20 years has been the exponential growth of the art biennial. Even after the pandemic, when things are still moving quite slowly, if you wanted and if you had the stamina, you could probably go to a biennial every day of the year.
You could, definitely.
How are these kinds of exhibitions contributing to the creation of a new canon?
So, canon itself usually refers to the artworks, but me being a historian of exhibitions, I also tend to refer to exhibitions and think about canon of exhibitions. And I think biennials have been quite substantial in a way they changed that canon. I think the canon itself, it's a very tricky notion. I think it needs to be approached with caution because, just like you said, it comes from a Western art history, and the problem is that if we continue using the vocabulary of art history, even to change it, we still somehow perpetuate the problems and the issues that came with it. So I think the rewriting of the art history is definitely happening. It's also happening in the exhibitions, and even biennials, which in opposition to museums really are looking towards the future and try to capture the zeitgeist, capture the art of today. So they're not really necessarily predispositioned the way that museums are. They don't have the kind of historical anchor, in their mission statement. They don't have a collection. But having said that, we have been seeing an increased number of exhibitions and curators taking interest in bringing different modernisms into the fore. So most recently, just 3 weeks ago, I was in Lyon, where there is an amazing exhibition about the Beirut art scene. Historically, there was several shows. So again, it's not necessarily, I think, and maybe that subject I will leave to my fellow speakers that perhaps they encounter it in their practice more often than I do. My question, and forgive me for being a little cheeky, but I see that rewriting art history is still a huge elephant in the room, and we don't really have an easy answer. People have been struggling with the issue. And sometimes I think, for me, it's a little bit like an old house. you can sort of patch the windows, right? The ceiling is leaking. You can do a lot of renovation, continue renovating for years. But there is also another option, which is to just demolish it and build from the scratch. And I just think that sometimes, I ask myself whether we should continue talking about Canon, because it brings back that, notion of individuality, of genius, of particular artworks being more important than the other.
Let me park that idea with you just 1 minute, because I want to come to Maya. And I want to come to Maya next because at this very moment in NYU Abu Dhabi Art Gallery, there is a groundbreaking exhibition. And I know lots of exhibitions are described as groundbreaking, but this one really is. It's called Khalij Modern, and it's a historical survey of 20th century art movements across the Arabian Peninsula. Never been done before. Tell us a bit about this show and what it means for art history here, what it means for you, because I know it's important.
Thank you, and thank you for having me. I want to pick up from your metaphor of the house, because I agree the house is broken, the roof is leaking. I'm going to build a new house next to your house. Can you hear me? Hello?
No.
How about now? Oh, good, I got
You're
to
on
practice
now?
before I'm loud. Can you hear me now?
Start again,
Okay.
because that was important and there are people
I
who
want to
missed
pick
it.
up from your metaphor of the house with the broken roof and the broken sidings, and we're trying to fix it. Do we tear it down? I'm proposing to build a new house and keep your house, and we can visit each other. How's that? We call it a biennial. So when I founded the NYU Abu Dhabi Art Gallery, I did not do it alone, but I did it with a big question, which is how do I serve in a meaningful way an audience here of over 200 nationalities? And the first thing you have to think about is, what does art mean to the visitor? It means a different thing to every person. And it also changes depending on where in the world you're looking at the art. And so my experience in this process of looking at art with my many different visitors was to discover the many gaps in the stories that we were told. And so Khalij Modern came about when I was in a conversation with Aisha Stobi when she was beginning her dissertation.
Who incidentally was the curator of the Oman
of the
Pavilion.
Oman Pavilion. Yes, so we
That's
both
Venice
curated
Biennale.
a pavilion this year. We're like twins. And she and I were both talking about this issue and how the invisibility begets itself. And it becomes sort of we say, oh, there's actually no art history here, and we're starting the art history, we're making art. And we know this is not true now, as a result, in part from her research, and then that led to her dissertation. While she was doing that research, I was also working with a curatorial team on an exhibition of the UAE's avant-garde, which is also not known, or was not now. It's very well known. But it was, in a way, setting the record straight, in a way, sort of throwing down the gauntlet and saying, all right, you guys, tell me about how there's no art history here again. Take a look. And we go back and we look at Bahrain in the 1940s, we look at Kuwait starting in the 1930s, and it sort of works its way through. And again, but the bigger problem is, how do we say what is art and when does it count? And this is where I would sort of ask us to ask ourselves why we call something art and who gets to decide that. So this exhibition is a question rather than an answer, I hope.
Big question.
Yeah.
Manal, let me come to you next, because Sharjah was a very early and has been for decades a very prominent presence, a quiet, discreet presence, but still very prominent in the globalizing art world. The first Sharjah Art Biennial was in 1993. How does Sharjah see its mission now, practically 30 years on?
Sharjah, can everyone hear me? Yeah. So Sharjah's dedication and promotion to the arts scene.
Can we increase the volume a little bit? I'm sorry.
Thank you.
What Manala's got to say is very, very important, and I want everybody to be able to hear.
Is it okay now? Are we good? Okay. So, so Sharjah's dedication promotion to the arts, as you mentioned, is very long-standing. It's decades long. This has been a passion of the ruler of Sharjah. So there was establishment of museums, there was establishment of collections, various kinds of collections, including art and modern art. So it's been something that it's just been part of the growing ecosystem of Sharjah, slowly, as you said, quietly, but we're building activities, building a whole ecosystem of artists and people in cultural production who are working to continue to enhance this vision for not only just for education, but one for providing this platform for Arab artists and for them to be able to showcase their work and what they're doing. It's been really important for us. Sorry, I'm not sure why it keeps going on.
This is not Manal's fault, I'm afraid. She has no control over the microphone.
Can we try again? I don't hear
Try
myself.
again, otherwise we'll get you a new one.
Okay. I don't think I hear myself speaking.
No, it's not working. Maybe.
Okay. Could we ask
Let's
for
do
a
it
new
handheld,
mic
yeah.
and we will come back to you?
Thank you so
Oh,
much.
thank you. That's very helpful. Thank you.
I prefer the traditional mics. Okay. Sorry, I lost my train of thought.
That's okay.
That's good.
All right. So we were saying that, so yes, it's been providing this platform and showcase for artists from the region in particular to have better exposure, to be for people, our publics, our audiences to know what is going on in the region, whether that's artists from the Gulf or from the Levant or from Northern Africa. So we've continued this mandate, but we've increased it again as part of what you're talking about in the Canon, which is the Canon is established, and we know, though, that it's not universal. We know that it's not permanent, but I mean, that's how it has appeared to be over the years. And part of it is looking at how to expand that Canon, how to bring in some change to that. So a lot of that has been introducing these artists to our public. So for the first time ever, we've had, since, for example, since 2010, we started a series, a yearly annual exhibition called Lasting Impressions. This exhibition focuses on artists from this region, the MENA region, and allows people for the first time to see artists who have been practicing 40, 50 years for the first time in their first retrospective or survey show. That's included artists from the UAE like Abdul Qadir Reyes or Dr. Najab Mekki, but also artists like Baya Muhyiddin that we had last year. This year, we're celebrating the Kurdish artist who just passed. May he rest in peace, Ismail Khayyat, Kurdish Iraqi artist. I mean, these are really important artists for people to know about, for scholars to learn about, students to learn about. So having the exhibitions, creating the publications, the education that goes along with it is integral to adding these layers to the canon that otherwise, yes, has been predominantly one or the other. I don't think it's binary, and I don't think we should look at it as non-Western and Western, but I think it's important to look at how we can add to that discourse as much as possible, because it is a power struggle at the end of the day.
Mm-hmm. Sultan, your collection, the Bajil Art Foundation's collection, is both wide and deep, very deep. You make huge efforts to lend works of art so that art from the region can be seen all over the world. And in fact, it's the way that many people encounter the region's artists for the very first time. As a foundation, what would you say is your main collecting ambition? Ooh, I love that. It's going to be a big answer.
I wasn't
Correct,
planning
come
on punching anybody. I think we have many ambitions. I don't think we have a single ambition. Our ambitions include displaying art from the Arab world in every corner of the world. Actually, I would like to display Arab art in every corner of the Arab world at first, because if you think about it, it's quite sad that there are major artists from the Arab world who are not on display in the Arab world. If you think about Diya Azawi, where in the Arab world can you go see Diya Azawi? You can't. Where can you go see Marwan? You can't. Where can you go see Ugat Kalant today? You can't. Can you imagine living in an area of 340 million people and you cannot take your child to go see this important artist? It's so sad. But you can go see a lot of Western artists. You can go see a lot of artists that are inconsequential to our part of the world. You know, there was an exhibition a few years ago that took place in the UK, and there was this British journalist who should never be doing any art reviews again, and he wrote a review. He went and he reviewed this exhibition, which I have nothing to do with, by the way, so it's not one of our shows. So I'm not, being mad at him for personal reasons. And he wrote, this exhibition of modern art from this region enforces the centrality of Western canon. And I thought, oh my God, this person has no idea about all the movements that took place in the region that contributed to this point, to this art canon. This person has no idea. How can you send someone to review an art exhibition when he doesn't know anything about the history of Awsham, the tattoo movement in Algeria, the history of horizonalism in Saudi, the history of one dimension in Iraq, crystalism in Sudan, circulism in Kuwait, just so many movements, so many schools, Hurufiyya in Iraq. How can you write reviews? How can you even critique art when you have no idea what you're looking at? So really, our ambitions include displaying art. To be honest, I care less about the Western world. I care more about our part. We need to make our kids proud of their culture. So we have to make sure that they can take their kids, their moms, their dads, their siblings, to go see art in the Arab world. And where can you see it? There's so few places. And so our ambitions are to show our art really here in the Arab world before we show it in the West. But we're trying everywhere. We try everywhere.
Let me play devil's advocate there for a moment. What about the accusation about a ghetto? Okay, you are representatives of the art world in the region. You support, in fact, you've established a mandate to support local infrastructure, local knowledge systems, in order to establish the discourse and art history of this region. How do you balance that with a more internationalist global review? And I want to go on to the Venice Biennale because this is important there. But you tell me first.
I've heard this argument of you're ghettoizing art from the Arab world.
No, I'm not saying you're ghettoizing.
From others,
saying
from others.
That is exactly.
I'm fine. I'm happy to answer that question. I'm happy to answer it. The reality is that 95% of exhibitions are about other places. So let us push as much as possible art from our region against this wave, against this surge of art that is coming at us. We need to show art from our part of the world, even if it is in universities, in museums, in galleries, everywhere. We have to push it because we have been inundated all our lives by art from the West, and we have to push back. Everybody has to push back because to have a conversation, you can't just be sitting there listening to someone talk at you. You have to push back so that you have a chance to explain yourself. And you know what? I don't mind being accused of ghettoizing Arab art, but the work is there. Just come take it, display it, borrow it, show it in museums. It's available for everybody. It's available for research. I am not hiding it. I'm not looking it up. We are sharing it with everybody, near and far. So I don't think in any way that by showing art from the Arab world that you are ghettoizing it. I think it's the same argument that people use about women, where women are, if you do exhibitions about women, they say, oh, well, women should be shown equally with men. I'm like, yeah, but no. Because you can't just say that you have 100 years of exhibitions about men, and then you say, now we'll start including women in our exhibitions. Like, you need to compensate for all the women who have been neglected and forgotten about. We have decades, if not centuries, to catch up about women art, and we have decades and centuries to catch up about Arab art.
Can I add to that? Fiona?
Absolutely.
I mean, I absolutely agree. I mean, when the museum in Sharjah, Art Museum, was opened, that was 25 years ago this year. So the reason that museum was built was for exactly that His Highness, the ruler of Sharjah, said, there's no place to see Arab artists, there's no place to see Arab art. This was really problematic for him, especially because art education at that time, and even up into present day in a lot of public schools, there's not enough that's being taught, especially about art from this region, or from the MENA region, let's say, as a whole. So for us, having a Sharjah Calligraphy Biennial that's also almost 20 years old, having the Sharjah Biennial, as you mentioned, since '97, having the Islamic Arts Festival, having this series of art that we do where we focus on regional artists, but also other exhibitions that we do are a way to encourage and, as he said, fill that gap that's there. But I mean, I don't think it needs to be as he's, you're talking about one or the other. It really needs to be an and. We should have female exhibitions, but we can also have female and male. I mean, however you want to look at it. But I'm not very big fan of binary things, but I do think, there is this place for do this and do that, and I think that's important, because what you don't want to do is create some other type of canon that it only starts to change the way in which you're still working within the confines of the canon, if you know what I mean. So, for example, he's talking about gender, and after the feminist movement, this is why women and a lot of women artists were looked at and presented in museums or collected in museums, but that's only because of that and because of post-colonial studies and ethnic studies, et cetera, that's happening. So there is more awareness, but this idea that you can create another alternative canon, I don't think is going to really work. I think you have to, what we're doing now, I guess, is working with what we have and trying to figure out a way to get in there and get that exposure. I mean, one thing I should just say, last night, I just out of for curiosity, I said, let me put, Arab art, and of course the first thing came up was all this Islamic art, so that has nothing to do with Arab art to a large degree. And then the other thing I looked up was modern Arab art, and Mathaf of Qatar came up the most, and then Barjeel collection, and then some of our exhibitions. So clearly Mathaf also, their mandate to do that, have a modern Arab art museum, has been tremendous, because actually you can find information online. Prior to that, for the little information I could find, there's not much out there, and that's sad. And as he's saying, we really need to work at adding to that big gaping hole we have in scholarship and information and everything else. So I totally understand.
Now you talk about working with what we have. One of the things that Sultan is doing is expanding what we have. And I want to go back to your collecting ambitions and that, because I don't think we'd quite finished on it. That expansion encompasses a huge amount of new discoveries. Tell us a little bit about what you've been doing.
I feel I spoke too much. Can someone else speak?
Never.
No.
Tell us some more.
You insist on me to,
absolutely, because I want to know. You showed me pictures on your phone the other day.
Are you talking about women?
That you've
talking
been
about
finding.
women art?
Yeah.
Okay, so yesterday we lost a very important artist, Layla Shawwa. She passed away aged 82, and she hasn't had an exhibition in the past 20 years. Layla Shawwa passed away. Just in the last 3 years, Ugat Kalant passed away. Ital Adnan passed away. Munir Farmayan passed away. I'm just thinking about women artists today. There's many male artists who also passed away. And these individuals really are treasure troves of history. They are witnesses to great change in the region. They saw the rise of nationalism, the rise of Islamism, the rise of wars and conflict. And they have not been recognized. They have not been interviewed. They have not been acknowledged. They have not had shows of their exhibitions, but there's a lot of shows of other artists I won't mention. So
Munir had a show in Sharjah. Our foundation.
Munir had a show. So a lot of them have not had exhibitions. A lot of them had not been recognized. And so we need to look at our own histories. We need to recognize that there's a lot of people passing away today. A lot of major artists are dying, and there are no interviews with them. And this makes me sad. This makes me sad that and I acknowledge that there's a lot of great work that's being done by Sharjah, by Abu Dhabi, by Qatar. I must give them credit for what they're doing. It's not enough, because there are hundreds of artists, and we need to do more. So I implore the authorities, please look at our art. It's not impressive to do Western exhibitions. It's not impressive. Nobody's impressed. Nobody except the people who are involved are impressed. Nobody's impressed. Nobody. If you go to China and I tell you there's an exhibition dedicated to Picasso or Chinese modernism, really, which one would you want to go to? If you go to Brazil and I tell you there's an exhibition dedicated to some Western artist or Brazilian modernism, which one would you want to go to?
Brazil, anytime.
Simple. But here, it's different.
Of course. So, the sort of connections that you've been talking about, the collecting, the deepening, the increasing of knowledge, we're seeing that happen all over the world. You've just been in, is it in the Pacific?
Singapore and Japan.
In Singapore and Japan, right. How are these connections being made across the Pacific, for example, just to use another global example, that, because they're happening without being filtered
Yes.
through any of the old centers, and that's something new.
Biennials actually have really interesting part in that story. You know, my research, I always kind of start, when I talk to students, I start my story of Biennales not in Venice, but in Havana in '84, because this was the first Biennale when they established it. They actually have this little document called Rules of Participation, and it very clearly states what they tried to accomplish, which was create a new horizontal connections, make sure that the artists, not only way for them to gain recognition is to pass through Western centers. And I would say that today, 40 years later, we actually start seeing that happening. It took a very long time. It's a work in progress, but I effectively see, I think Sharjah is also a great example, what Sharjah has been doing with Africa Institute. That's a great example. There is another fantastic Biennale in Riyadh that opened last year, first edition, when they connected with China directly. So it's happening. And in Singapore, for example, I saw connections across Pacific because they brought a lot of artists from Hawaii, from Honolulu. So those connections are definitely start happening and becoming sort of part of everyday practice, and it's just pure joy to see that. Because I think in '84, when people started that Biennale in Havana, it was still like something. It was an aspiration, and now we actually see that happening 40 years later. So it just warms my heart, and yeah.
So for me to see Abdullah Ibrahim at the Venice Biennale, whatever you say about seeing Arab art here, and it's important that it be shown, for me to see Mohammed Ibrahim in Venice was incredibly important.
Mm. Yes, that's my answer. I do think that the role of the biennial allows us to see, in a way, it's a challenge because we're decontextualizing the art, right? So the visitors to the Venice Biennial may not know where the UAE is on a map, much less the history that surrounds Mohammed Ahmed Ibrahim and what this work is referring to. And this is the number one problem when you're curating exhibitions that include art from more than one region, is that you have to contextualize everything in order to fully understand the work. You don't want your visitor to have to read a giant text to fully understand the work. So the work, to some extent, needs to stand on its own terms to audiences that may or may not understand the context from which it comes. But it's really frustrating because there's actually an incredible story behind the body of work that he's made. And one of the things that I discovered is how much of what he does is happening in dialogue with where he's from physically. So things that are so obvious to him, he doesn't think to even talk about it until I spend days with him interviewing and looking where he lives. And sort of, he calls it like getting on the therapy couch with me, trying to go and figure out where, what's happening with his art and what he's doing. How do I get that to the visitors?
Where he lives, 'cause not everybody will know.
So one example would be that the forms in his work look almost like hieroglyphics, and he hates that word. He's like, they're not. They're more like signs. Signs that nobody can read, but which he's making in order to communicate with you. And I realized that, in fact, there's rock art in that region and around this region that has a direct kind of formal connection to what he's doing. And it's embedded in his, and he says, yes, I don't think about it, but it's there. It's in my psyche. So there's this sort of really deep cultural framing that needs to happen to read his art on one level, but he doesn't believe that that's what matters the most. What he believes matters is the direct connection between the viewer and the art. And so I'm always, as a curator, toggling between historicizing and trying to, what is the historical narrative for an artist who grew up in a place where people weren't writing art history about the world that he's in? So we have to both write the context and create the history and then position him within that. Meanwhile, at Venice Biennial, he's out there on his own, context-free, except for people's preconceptions about whatever CNN has told them about the UAE. So, love CNN, it's great. But you know, this sort of popular culture imaginings of the Middle East and all the questions that we get when we come here, we meaning people who weren't from here originally. I think travelers in this room may have experienced this as well, the sort of stereotypes and cliches, that's what they bring into that pavilion moment. That's what his art is up against. And I think what Sultan has been doing with his collection and what Manal is doing is they're doing the hard work of making that context, getting it out there so that someday you don't walk in and the first thing you think is, where's the UAE and do they have art there? And you know, and that you need both. You need the framework, and the art has to speak on multiple registers on its own terms. And that this is why the canon, I think, is problematic, because the idea of a canon relies on an existing framework, and we don't all share the same frameworks, nor should we, nor can we. And they change when you go to a biennial in Havana, or when I go to the Dhaka Art Summit. The art looks totally different. The same art looks different. And I'm the same person. But yeah. So.
Part of what's really important of what you do, Sultan and Manal, is to make the art that you've collected easily available, to lend, to see. Tell us a bit about some of the practicalities of making it easy for institutions, exhibitions to borrow, because that goes on behind the scenes. A lot of people don't know how complicated that is. It has to do with payment, or it has to do with insurance, or it has to do with all. Tell us a little bit about that.
My answer will be shorter because he does a lot more loans abroad, so he can talk about that. But I think one of the biggest concerns, the elephant in the room is that I am from a museum. I'm part of the institutions that create canons, right? So yeah. I understand that me also talking about this might seem a little funny as well. But there are many players in this, right? So there's the art market. We were talking about that earlier, about who values what and everything else, how museums and certain things contextualize things. But going back to also what Maya said, you know, this socio-historical context is often missing from how we aesthetically value art, and so it's a struggle. And I think for us, one of our main concerns as a free museum, the Art Museum has been free since its inception, was that we have to try to give that context to our audiences, and our audience demographic is very varied. It is young children to families, etc. But children are like our main focus. His Highness has always been adamant that he wants young children to have more knowledge and more understanding of where they're coming from, how they connect to the wider world. He believes that will give them a better future if they can see those connections in life. And we talked about connections a lot during this summit, but when you really look at a particular example of a story of how this connects to that, it really can open your eyes to what are the possibilities of you as an individual, but also how you embrace other things, but you also legitimize the art or the culture of a particular place or people. In terms of, like you said, the practicalities, it's not always easy. I mean, contextualizing things, as you know, is very difficult in a museum. So much of it is removed. A lot of art that comes from particular or talks about particular situations, Sultan can also talk about that. Political issues, let's say, are not always easy to explain, to interpret, and so it's kind of you have to figure it out as you go along. What's enough to say? What you can't really say at this moment, because it's also going to what you said, it's a process. I mean, you're talking about decades to get to a certain point, so we're also doing the same thing. We're not trying to get everything done in a month or a year. We're looking at the long term. I hope to be there another 20 years, but after me, I'm hoping to see that we're going to see this growth, right? Every 5 years, I see something we're able to do that we weren't able to do 5 years ago. You mentioned a biennial, and quickly I'll say, when I went to the biennial in 2007, I think, or 5, when I first started working in Sharjah, a lot of people laughed at the biennial. I mean, people in the audience were just like, what is this? Like, I've never seen this stuff. This isn't art. This is nonsense. And there was a lot of kind of, joking about this contemporary art in particular. And now, only just a few years later, people have so much appreciation and understanding, and even if they don't understand it, they understand that, okay, this is something that maybe I don't really understand or I don't like, and that's fine. But there is at least this acceptance to a certain degree, where before it was rejected. So that's a really short span of time. Education has played a big part, and obviously patrons and other people have done that in institutions too. So I think that adds a lot to what we're trying to do. But I'll let Sultan also talk about.
Yeah, all over the world there are exhibitions that have works that have come from your foundation. Those exhibitions wouldn't happen if you guys hadn't put some thought, put your hands in your pockets, but also put some thought into what are the practicalities of making that happen. Tell us a bit about what goes on behind the scenes.
This is the first time I speak in public in 3 years. So I'm thinking to myself, like, how far do I go to talk about it? Like, I'm trying to censor myself just out of courtesy and just to be polite to everybody. But the reality is that it's very difficult to be where we are. I think
difficult. It's very difficult
for us. I tell you, there's so many challenges. We have 300 works on loan this month, or on display this month, one way, someplace in the world or another. 300 works in South Africa, in Europe, in Mexico, in America, in Canada, in Europe, in Asia, in the Middle East. 300 works. You can imagine, every one of those works needs to be condition checked, the insurance, the documents, the crate, the logistics, the back and forth. It's very difficult.
Insure them.
We pay for this. It's very expensive. Buying a work doesn't mean paying. Somebody tells me, oh, you bought this work for $10,000, will you sell it for 12? And for me, that's an insult, because you get the work, you condition check it, you restore it, you look after it, you care for it, you love it, you develop emotions towards it. It's not just financial, it's not a number. And I want to say that, again, I want to say that I acknowledge the UAE is probably the best place in the region to be based, the best place in the region. We have insurance companies, we have logistics, airports, creating companies, everything is based here. But the regulations are out of date. If I can sit here and tell you that everything's fine, it's not. It's not fine. I want more collectors to move to the UAE, and I'm using this platform here to say this. They have to update the regulations. I'll tell you, we have crates that went to America for an exhibition. The pandemic happened. The works take longer to come back. There's a clause in the UAE regulations that says if works leave for longer than a certain period, you have to pay import tax again, as if we're importing them once again. This is unacceptable. I can't afford it. I can't pay $1 million to bring back works that were originally here. We're advertising for the UAE as a base for culture in the region. We send works internationally. They come back and they want us to pay hundreds of thousands of dollars in import tax. This is unacceptable. This will discourage other people from moving here. So I don't know who needs to hear this. I'm here on the platform. I'm hoping that this gets to somebody. Please update our regulations. We want collectors in Germany and France and India and Pakistan and Saudi and everywhere in the world to bring their collections to us. The regulations are from the 1980s. And we are in 2022. This is unacceptable. So it's so expensive. Please, whoever's in charge, please, with all due respect and love to the people in charge, with all due respect and love, please update the regulations. We can't afford it. It's so consuming and bureaucratic. Now, you asked me another question, but I can't remember. I think I'll stop there.
I hope you're listening.
I can add a PS to that. Our exhibition could not have happened without the loans from the Barjeel Art Foundation in Sharjah and from the Bahrain National Museum and private collectors and estates and artist studios and the grandson of the person in the painting who was willing to take it off the wall above their couch and send it to us. 21 lenders for this exhibition to tell the story. Collectors make it so much easier when they commit to building a collection in the way that you have. It makes it possible to tell these stories. This show was already a 5-year project to pull together these loans. And I just thank you for not making it a 10-year project. So I think that the part about lending, it can't be underestimated. It really is huge.
And the crucial thing to take away is that this is not an exercise in scratching each other's backs. the children that you're talking about would not learn about this art or be
Exactly.
able to see it if the grown-ups hadn't worked in this way. So we've got a few minutes left. I'm not going to take any questions from the public because we've got a wrap-up panel after this, but I want to do a quick whip round. As art lovers, as art educators, if you had one wish for the region for the next decade, what would it be? Rafael, you're the outsider.
I would side with Sultan and say that, that there is definitely still an issue here with the, forgive me for using economic terms, export deficit. So definitely more.
What do you mean by that? The export deficit?
That this region is still there is amazing talent, there is amazing energy, but a lot of skills still have to be imported, and we see that around, And so I think eventually getting to the point where actually this is a place that is exporting more and importing in terms of exhibition, in terms of artists. For me, they're obviously seeing more exhibitions coming from here at museums elsewhere, not necessarily in Europe, US, but also in Japan or in Australia. I think that would be really interesting, and maybe that would be my wish for the region, but also for everybody else.
Maya, what would it be for you?
So many wishes. I think the main one I have is a more existential one, and it's one for the multiple art worlds that exist, which is that each of us decide for ourselves what we value in art and be open to seeing art from multiple vantage points that allows us to actually change the hierarchical nature of art viewing and art narratives.
Manal.
I've just given it some thought. And I'm not just saying this because Sultan's here, but Sultan is often here not because he's just such a lovable character, but also because he's very few of the patrons that are around. I mean, that's the honest truth. Yeah. And I think my wish would be that we'd have more patrons, and not just patrons in the sense of just buying art, but patrons who are there to offer support, whether financial or otherwise, for artists of different media, whether it's filmmaking, it's literature, writing, experimental work, that there's more people out there helping people to create, artists to create and produce in this region. I know a lot of artists who are in different areas than the sort of visual arts in particular, and they find it really difficult to find anyone who will help them. So besides government grants and everything else that are available to some extent, they are in charge, and some other emirates too that are developing them. But I think private patronage is very important, and having people very similar to Sultan who are not just there to showcase work, but to really get that academic, scholarly exposure, but also to have people learn to love what's here and value it and enjoy it. I mean, that's really important, and I think we have to have more of that. We have to have more of him around. So he's not the only person always talking about this with that much passion and fervor. So
Sultan, before we use the new technology to recreate you in multiple forms,
clone you,
what would your wish be?
Well, my wish is to have many wishes.
There will be many Sultans, so there will be many wishes.
That was my wish.
All of our wishes. My wish is all their wishes to come true. My wish is for more recognition for the work that Manal is doing, that Maya is doing, that Manuel is doing, that Reem Fadda is doing, that Sheikh Ahour is doing, that Sheikh Latifa is doing. Everybody in the UAE is doing, pushing our art from the region, displaying art from the Middle East. In the Middle East, my wish is to see more. My wish is to see kids recognize our artists and not recognize the Picasso, but recognize the Marwan, recognize the Dhiya, recognize the Uget, recognize artists that are of and from us. And I think we're getting there. And that's the good news. I want to end on a high note and say that there is the demand. There's the demand for art from the region. There's the interest for art from the region. There's the artwork selling in the next hour by Etel Adnan that's past £300,000 in the UK, an online sale. This is an artist that we bought 3-4 years ago for £40,000-50,000. There is the demand, financial demand, cultural demand. There's so much beauty going on. We just need to shine a light on it and keep pushing against the Western rhetoric. Keep pushing and adding to what the gentleman said, adding our beauty, adding more. That's what I would say.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.